Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this very distinguished and gender-balanced panel talking about NATO and the role of NATO after the invasion of Ukraine. We have spent the past 2 days talking a lot about the Europe and European Union's response to the invasion of Ukraine, and I'm very glad that we can also bring NATO into this debate at the Delphi Economic Forum. We are facing a major change in our security environment, not only in Europe, but in the broader Euro-Atlantic area and our neighborhood. But we are also witnessing some major technical changes and shifts to our international rules-based order as we know it. So what does all of this mean for NATO? We are 3 months away from the NATO leaders meeting in Madrid, where we are due to adopt the strategic concept of NATO. That's our strategic guiding document for the next decade. And I would pose a question to my distinguished panel. What do you believe should be the tasks for NATO in a short-term, medium-term, and the long-term perspective for our alliance? I would quickly introduce the panel to you. We have Her Excellency, Madam President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic, the former President of Croatia and the former Assistant Secretary General at NATO. We also have Christine Ockrent from France, a columnist, writer, and commentator. We have Ambassador Kurt Volker, who also is a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, a distinguished fellow at SIPA, a think tank in Washington, D.C., and many, many other qualifications that I have no time to go through. We also have with us Mr. Spilios Livanos, who is a member of the Greek Parliament, but also the head of the Greek delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which is a very important consultative body to us. And last but not least, we have Bruno Tertrais, who is the Deputy Director from French Foundation for Strategic Research. So without further ado, let me start with you, Madam President. What would you advise us as we are drafting the strategic concept?
Well, certainly, good afternoon, everyone, first of all. We've repeated it so many times, and yes, this is Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the biggest crisis in Europe with global consequences, and most certainly we are at a historic, critical geostrategic inflection point, and this is what NATO must take into account when looking at the next strategic concept, because the circumstances, the environment since the last strategic concept has changed greatly. First of all, we're witnessing systemic competition around the world, competition even for values, alignment, different alignments on that, competition for resources, etc. Second, we see the rise of geoeconomics, and in that sense, the rise of China as one of the major powers, as one of predominant aspects of the 21st century, and geoeconomic attempts at controlling the political and the geopolitical space. And third, we have seen the compounding of the so-called asymmetric threats to security, from terrorism to climate change, that they have been compounded by disruptors such as pandemics, for instance, but also by emerging and disruptive technologies. So what NATO has to take into account, first of all, the long-term consequences of Russia's invasion on Ukraine and how that will affect NATO's military posture in both the core aspect of collective defense and deterrence. In the short term, NATO must do everything to increase that defense and deterrence, in particular in the eastern nations, in the eastern allies. We have to continue a dual-track approach to Russia with every attempt to find a negotiated solution insisting on Russia ceasing the aggression, pulling out the forces, and sitting around the table to find a diplomatic solution in good faith, and also continue to aid Ukraine in their national interest and in the interest of all of us, and their right to self-defense, which is enshrined in the UN Charter as well. In the medium and long term, NATO really has to seriously look at capabilities, and it has to move from the territorial frontiers into the domain frontiers and respond to the emergence of new technologies, the emerging technologies, and the disruptive technologies in all of the domains of the modern warfare, which has changed its character. And that means on land, sea, air, but also in cyberspace, in space, and in the domains of information and knowledge, which means harnessing innovation and defense industry across both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It seems that we have a long list of things to do, and maybe building up on what you mentioned about our capabilities and strengthening our deterrence defense. The best person perhaps to follow up would be Bruno. As a military expert and analyst of defense issues, what would be your recommendation to us at NATO?
Well, actually, I'm going to issue some words of caution.
Okay.
But first of all, when a French president who declared NATO brain dead 3 years ago now says that the alliance has had an electroshock, quote unquote, you know that the alliance is in good shape. However, I do have 6 words of caution. Okay. Some of them related to the strategic concept, but the others related with alliance politics. The first one is as follows. Beware of a strategic concept which would be exceedingly focused on Russia. We know that the current strategic concept will have had a life, an age of 10 years. It was impossible to revise it earlier because of the Trump presidency, but the next strategic concept should be valid for at least 5, if not 10 years. So who knows what the strategic concept is, what the context is going to be in 5 to 10 years from now. Let's not completely step away from taking care of what does the Chinese challenge mean for the alliance in the long run. How will we face a sudden resurgence of terrorism? Those issues, it's entirely natural and necessary that we focus on Russia right now. But let's not forget that the strategic concept is supposed to have a shelf life of at least a few years. Second word of caution, an obvious one, beware of vulnerability of non-members. Finland and perhaps Sweden will get some speedy treatment if they are willing to be officially candidates. But how about Moldova? How about other non-members? I think it would be very important for the alliance to find the right words which are below Article 5 but beyond mere words of sympathy, as in to discourage future Russian encroachment or aggression. I call it Article, you can call it Article 5 minus, but let's not breach the sanctity of Article 5. So let's find different ways to call it. I think it's entirely irrelevant for many reasons, including that one, that forward defense replaces tripwire for a large part of the front line. Third word of caution, beware of, for lack of a better expression, the temptation of a Russian non-Article 5 revenge. It's going to be a very wounded bear, one which is going to be, quote, humiliated, but I hasten to say that we will not be the one, just like we have not been the one humiliating Russia. Russia humiliated itself. It's on the way to humiliate itself once again. Beware of what the super humiliated Russia could do in the future below Article 5 or outside Article 5. Fourth, beware of the appearance of consensus. The alliance, as far as I understand it, the NAC is working very well these days. When there are, as it legitimate, internal debates and discussions, they're not that visible outside, which is good. I'm not sure how much this will hold in terms of what will Turkey be in a year from now as it approaches its presidential election. Turkey favors, solidarity with its allies today. It's very important. It's good. How will Turkey behave when its own presidential election approaches? I don't know. And of course, how will the United States behave under a very different president, and one which is, once again, as it happened during the Trump years, maybe it will be Mr. Trump once again, eager to get away from Europe and focus on East Asia. So these are big question marks. We should not, self-celebrations are good, forward-looking thinking is even better. Finally, one very simple point for my American friends and for many of my European friends. I'm always skeptical when I hear the argument, we have to make sure that we are relevant for the United States, because otherwise they will leave. This is an argument that keeps creeping up in transatlantic debate that I've heard over and over the past 30 years. I think the United States, if the United States believe it is in its own national interest to remain engaged in Europe, it will remain engaged in Europe. And what we do, we do as Europeans, is not irrelevant, of course, but it's not the determining factor. We don't decide what Washington will do. And the fact that we need to beef up our own defense efforts has its own merits, but I don't think that the argument we need to do that to make sure that the United States stays engaged in Europe is the right one. So that was my sixth and final word of caution.
Thank you very much. I think they were very clear and well noted. And since we did start talking a little bit about our transatlantic relations, I'm looking at Kurt there, maybe as an immediate reaction from across the big pond.
Sure. Well, I'm remembered of a quote from Winston Churchill, which is that you can always count on the United States to do the right thing after it has exhausted all the other possibilities. But no, I think the U.S. will maintain its own self-interest of working with a Europe that advances security for all of us. I think that you can count on that. Should I continue on the broad
please.
Themes? Okay.
Yes, please.
So on this, I worked on the last three strategic concepts. This is the first one that I'm not involved with in any way. And my experience from that is that they don't chart the future, they describe what is. We have to be, it just describes what we are. And here, I think NATO has done an outstanding job in the past few months on Article 5, collective defense and deterrence. It is not only expressed in ironclad terms, but it's also expressed in deployments and positioning so that there can be no doubt that NATO is serious about Article 5. On the other hand, the second core function of NATO is crisis management. And here I would say that NATO has done a very unimpressive job. We have the biggest war going on in Europe since World War II, and NATO has barely had a profile of what to do. Individual allies have done quite a lot. And I think the last number I saw was 26 out of 30 NATO allies have contributed some kind of security assistance to Ukraine. That's very impressive. But it's unclear what NATO's crisis management role is here. And I think there's more that could be done. And I think as we think about where we are and think about the strategic concept, NATO will be defining itself by what it does over the next few months. And that's what will actually be NATO in the future. And here I would think we should be taking a moment to think about the historic changes going on and where this needs to be. One of them is that there can be no going back to business as usual with Russia under Vladimir Putin or with Russia occupying eastern Ukraine. That I think these make it off limits. So this is a different kind of relationship with NATO than anything, or with Russia than anything NATO has had for the past several years. Second, I've just had many meetings in Brussels over the past few days about, on the EU side. The change in mentality there is striking. Ukraine is a European country. You don't go to a meeting and they say, well, Ukraine is a challenge, or we have to, it's difficult. You hear, Ukraine is a European country, we have to get this right. I think NATO needs to adopt the same mentality. The third thing is that I think a lesson that we can learn from the past several months is that gray zones are a bad idea. If you leave countries in limbo, it's an invitation to conflict. And so I think as we look ahead, I take under good advisement Bruno's words about no humiliation of Russia. But frankly, we can't sacrifice countries like Ukraine or Georgia on the altar of not humiliating Russia.
Just to make it clear, Kurt, Russia is humiliating itself.
It is.
I'm not saying that this was not my discourse.
No, and I agree with you. But what I'm saying is that we cannot go forward into a situation where we leave ambiguity about Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova. I think NATO needs to have a serious reflection about what types of security arrangements will apply for these countries in the future, as well as the Western Balkans, so that we don't leave these gray zones in the future. And then the final point I'll make is that I was very impressed watching NATO yesterday. First time in the course of this conflict. I thought that the defense ministers meeting, the first foreign ministers meeting, the summit, they all left you waiting. What's going to happen? I finally got the feeling yesterday that NATO has now decided that Ukraine's survival as a sovereign, independent European state is a NATO interest. And that is a critical realization to come to. And I think that will guide NATO's work going forward. The final point, what NATO has started to do and must continue to do is warn against any use of weapons of mass destruction. That this would cross a red line that should draw a forceful response and therefore must never happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad to hear that our foreign ministerial meeting yesterday and the day before did bring some important decisions that are considered by pundits like you and experts as charting the way forward in concrete terms in support to Ukraine. May I now turn to Madame Ockrent. What would your advice or recommendation be to NATO from your perspective?
Well, I certainly wouldn't dare give any advice. But I'll try and make 3 points, if I may. The first point is we should all remember that NATO is first and foremost a political alliance. And so it is very important to maintain the consensus, the political consensus, that in a paradoxical and extremely cruel way, the Russian aggression in Ukraine has forced us to realize. Bruno was mentioned in Turkey. It's just remember the awe when we discovered that Turkey was actually getting Russian weapons not that long ago. The fact that Turkey obviously wants to play a key diplomatic role in trying to implement some sort of negotiations, it shows that for the time being at least, President Erdogan sees his Ottoman ambition channeled through a role within NATO for the time being, and I think it's extremely important. However ambiguous Turkey's relations with Russia may be because of Syria. The same applies to France. Of course, we will have a clearer view in a couple of weeks, but it is very important that in spite of President Macron talking about NATO as being brain dead, that was about 2 years ago in that interview to The Economist, in spite of the old, how could I put it, anti-American streak within French elites and even French public opinion, now we have discovered we have a common enemy. And even those presidential candidates, we'll see how they fare, even those on both extremes, left and right, who thought that Vladimir Putin was such a nice guy, they have tried very hard to actually erase whatever they were able to say on that score. So even France, with a ghost of General de Gaulle and this idea that, you know, how could France submit to American supremacy, I think that's all obsolete. We have a common enemy, and President Macron has been extremely forceful, even though the idea that the French are always pushing for European strategic economy, European defense, and how can actually articulate with NATO. It's a question mark, but it goes in the same direction. In the medium term, and I'm, of course, talking under the authority of the ambassador, it seems to me that NATO, as a political alliance with a military outreach, should focus more on cyber. Mm-hmm. It is very worrying, I think, that concerning cyber warfare, and indeed Ukraine is also a cyber warfare, it seems that NATO is very, if not oblivious, but certainly not even coordinating what can be done at the national level here or there. And of course, that also involves our British friends, who are very much needed in any sort of military and strategic plan. But I think that cyber is indeed the horizon, which should be NATO's horizon in the medium term, if not in the very short term. And my third point has to do with the American leadership of NATO. I was very struck by the fact that at that meeting that you just mentioned, there were 3 foreign ministers for the first time: Japan, Korea, Australia, which means that indeed the US are still looking at NATO as having to move eastward to the Indo-Pacific, which in fact had been, if I'm right, on Stoltenberg's agenda a few months before. Of course, and even before Kabul. The idea that, of course, to the US, whoever is president, China is the main challenge, and so European allies should actually sustain the same vision. And so I think that in the long term will be an issue with us Europeans, because we have our own priorities, and although China is part also of the challenge, the terms are not quite the same. Mm-hmm. So I think in the long term that's something to worry about.
Can I? Sorry.
Sure.
Just a couple of sentences on that. This crisis, actually, this war has changed my perspective as European on China as well. And I see China now as more of a challenge that NATO needs to tackle. Because you can imagine in this crisis now, China not condemning Russia, on the other hand, helping Russia economically, etc. You can imagine a perfect storm where Moscow and Beijing plan together a systemic crisis around the world and chaos that would drag us into a very significant international conflict that could involve the great powers, which ultimately could mean nuclear as well. So I think that talking about China in the context of NATO and building the forward resilience with partners such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and others in the Pacific is also one of the ways that we must tackle the geopolitical realities of today.
I think that's one of the big debates we might be having at the table at the Council, and definitely we do see some change of rhetoric and the discussion, including the Secretary General, and I quote here, saying yesterday, it's the first time, when talking about the Strategic Council, it's the first time we must take into account how China's growing influence and coercive policies affect our security, end of the quote. But of course, as always, the devil is in the details, and we need to strike the right balance in this. Let me now go to our Greek host and the head of the Greek delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Mr. Livanos. What would be your view from the Greek perspective towards NATO and its future strategic concept?
Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. I'm very happy that you're all here, and we all hope that you have a good time apart from these nice discussions. What's striking, I've been scrabbling here because being last, I don't want to repeat things that have already been said, so I've been struggling through my notes, but what I've seen is that President Putin's success, among others, was that we all are in the same gear. I saw, except a little bit of a difference in the last debate between Her Excellency and, what's her name? Christine. And Christine. All else, we are all on the same boat. And I feel that this is a big change in the way that we will perceive things from now on. The first thing that I wanted to say is that as NATO becomes a little bit more, or more political, from what it was, and it has to become more political, the EU simultaneously looks a little bit more at its defense, its possible, if possible, autonomous defense. But in any way, we're investing more. States, Germany, firsthand opened this dialogue very firmly. And we see that the defense investment pledge is going to be a huge thing for all of us. Greece was there already due to other problems that we face here in the Mediterranean. But other countries will follow this path, and I think that we'll have an extension for the year 2024 in order to invest more in our defense mechanisms. Saying that, obviously, all this huge upheaval with the disastrous war creates political problems in many of our states, and we see these going on to elections. Therefore, we see how President Macron is having a problem, at least for the last few days, when the gap is closing among him and the second runner-up. And that we will have to see and check it out not only in our EU debates, but also it has to go into NATO's thinking. Mm-hmm. There are other things coming behind. The economic crisis that we're all facing and the energy crisis will create problems of food security, and then after that we will have an increase of people fleeing out of the poorest parts of the world, Africa, Asia, coming in to Europe, and that will create new problems for us. Therefore, we must all see how we tackle these problems, and NATO has to get into these more political issues. Obviously, Turkey is a country that will always come into our conversations. We understand the strategy of President Erdogan, and we see that because of the war and because of the changes in everybody's minds and in the mindset of Europe itself, we have a different dialogue between Turkey and Greece, which I don't know how much we're following it, but immediately after the war, we have the two parts are reaching each other in order to find solutions. You could say, but why don't you find solutions all this time before? But anyway, that's a success for all of us, and in that way we must work together. The only thing that I wanted to mention and have a small differentiation from what Kurt said is that you said that in the context of the three main missions of the alliance, NATO did not really do well in the crisis management part. I don't disagree with you. I just see a little bit why this happened. It happened because if NATO didn't leave the bilateral actions and went in a little bit more firmly, then we could have an escalation of the war, we could have an escalation of the problems arising, and therefore I think it was a cautious move. I agree, though, with you that we will have to rethink about that and how we will get into the next phase, because, I don't know, it's 45 days now from the beginning of the war, and we still don't know what's coming next. Therefore, it's very interesting that we're all getting into this dialogue, and the only thing that I wanted to add up is in what the previous speaker said, is the need for the coexistence of the strategic concept of NATO together with the strategic compass, as we said it in the EU, which came in last month and is quite interesting. Apart from that, I think we're on the same track.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. And also thank you very much for bringing into our debate not only the role of the European Union and NATO-EU coexistence, but also the fact that we both are, apart from a few months, working on our strategic guiding documents, whether you call it compass or concept. It's SC in any case. Because at NATO we have all these terminology. We only have, unfortunately, less than 4 minutes left, which gives me 1 minute to each of the speakers. If we meet here next year, hopefully we will get invited again. If we meet here next year, where do you think we will be, and what were our predictions so far with the brand new strategic concept? And you can issue warnings. We like that. Bruno, looking at you.
Okay, assuming we still have the same French president.
Okay.
Because if it's a different French president, maybe we'll have a French problem.
Hoping.
I would say the transformation.
Hoping we'll have the same president.
Sorry?
Hoping we'll have the same French president.
But we're supposed to be neutral here. No, I would say that it's very likely, from my standpoint, that we'll have moved from an immediate Russian threat to a long-term serious Russian problem, which will be caused as much by its weaknesses as by its strengths. That's at least a reasonable working hypothesis.
Considering we're in Delphi, we don't have the Delphi oracle with us right now, unfortunately, so we have to do the modern version of the strategic foresight, as we call it. Madam President.
What I hope for is that we'll have the next strategic concept that will respond to all of these security challenges that we have discussed, and that will not be limiting options, but it will be expanding options. The military has often complained that the civilian side of NATO points to the strategic concept as saying this isn't what we do, so I think we must avoid that, and we must work together in order for NATO to really continue to be adapting quickly, because the situation in the future will be changing at an ever-increasing speed.
Thank you. Chrissy?
Well, my hope is that we will have the same French president in 2 weeks' time. If only within the framework of this debate, if only to push forward European integration, which I think for our continent remains the most constructive and important common project. And so my hope is that within the NATO consensus, our European consensus stays solid.
We will have the same French president, but we will not have the same Russian president. And we'll be sitting here figuring out how we rebuild a relationship with Russia. And our ability to do so depends upon Russia reconciling with its own past and actions, much as Germany did after World War II.
you. And last but not least, Mr. Livanos.
Well, I'm an optimist. And I feel that the world will be safer next year if we get here to Delphi. And I hope that we'll have a closer relationship between the European Union, the US, the AP4 countries, and we will simultaneously have a redirection of China's path. And I hope they will work constructively with us on top of everything, not just economics, by trying to share a little bit more our values of democracy and freedom.
Thank you very much. I had a wonderful panel. We finished right on time. I wish we could go on for longer. Thank you to the audience for staying with us, and we hope to see you all again next year at our discussion on NATO after the strategic concept. Thank you.